Welcome back to Vale of Epochs, where we take you through the fascinating parts of history that your textbook quietly ignored. Probably because they involved carbs. Today's story? Forget cryptocurrency. Forget gold. Forget whatever made up thing NFTs were. Let's talk about the original edible economy, bread. Yes, there was a time in human history when your salary came freshly baked. Your savings account smelled like yeast. And your idea of going bankrupt meant we're out of baguettes. In ancient Egypt, you didn't just earn bread, you were paid in bread. And beer. Because apparently, working on a pyramid required carbs and light intoxication. Who knew? We'll explore a world where bakeries were like banks. Mold was considered inflation. And a loaf of sourdough could spark a civil dispute. So tighten your apron. Raise your crusty assets. And let's dive into the yeasty underbelly of the world's first food-based financial system. This is Bread Bank, when your savings account was full of loaves, where the economy rose and fell. Just like dough. Let's imagine, for a moment, that you live in ancient Egypt. The sun is merciless. The Nile floods annually like clockwork. And your boss is a shirtless man shouting something about bricks and eternity. You're sweating through a linen kilt. And after a 14-hour shift stacking heavy stone blocks to build what you suspect is a really impractical triangle, you finally get your paycheck. And there it is, not gold. Not coins. Not even a palm leaf IOU. Just bread. And maybe some beer if management's feeling generous. Welcome to the world's oldest payday. And welcome to the world's most delicious economy. In ancient Egypt, bread wasn't just food. It was currency. It was accounting. It was status. It was basically the apple stock of the Bronze Age. Only flakier and more prone to attracting rats. Workers, from farmers to pyramid builders to temple staff, were often paid in standard loaves of bread, with beer as a sort of corporate bonus package. Forget direct deposit, you got direct dough. The logic was surprisingly sound. Egypt had a grain-based economy. Literally, barley and emmer wheat were staples. And there was more wheat than anyone knew what to do with, which is why they used it to build society, feed laborers, and apparently, pay rent. That's right, you could pay taxes in bread. You could pay dowries in bread. You could settle court fines, 2 loaves for insulting a priest. And don't let it happen again. Bread was not just money. It was everything. But here's the best part, this bread economy was institutionalized. They didn't just toss you a baguette and say good luck. No, Egypt had actual accountants whose entire job was to track how much bread everyone had. Imagine the world's most serious man, with a shaved head and a reed pen, solemnly writing, Horemheb's 4 loaves and half a jug of barley beer to Ptah-hotep, due before the next flood season. That's bookkeeping, baby. Temples, palaces, and granaries acted as the banks of the day. You could store bread, which was kind of like opening a savings account. Assuming your savings could get eaten by mice or go stale by next Thursday. But even that had a workaround. They didn't store just baked bread, often it was stored as grain, which was more durable. These centralized grain storage facilities were protected, guarded, and, I kid you not, considered sacred. Stealing from a state granary was like robbing a divine vault. Punishment? Usually death. Or worse, exile to the desert, where there was no bread, just sand, and regret. And if you're wondering, yes, people really did get into bread debt. You could take out a loan, in grain or bread, and if you didn't pay it back on time, the local officials came knocking, possibly with a stick. There are surviving papyri where scribes complain that so-and-so hasn't paid their wheat loan back from 2 flood seasons ago. It's the Bronze Age version of we've been trying to reach you about your overdue account. Meanwhile, the elite didn't even touch their bread. No, they had servants for that. The upper class measured their wealth in how much grain they owned. like modern billionaires measuring their worth in yachts or luxury bunkers. They didn't need to worry about whether their sourdough was rising, someone else handled that. Bread became symbolic, offerings to gods, tokens of power, and fuel for a divine bureaucracy where yeast was your credit score. But before we get too romantic about this carb-based utopia, let's be clear, this was not a gluten-free economy. It was a survival system in a world where calories were currency and famine was always a bad flood away. When the Nile didn't behave, everything collapsed. No water meant no grain. No grain meant no bread. No bread meant riots, political instability, and pharaohs getting extremely nervous. So yes, your ancestors lived in a society where people literally said, "I work for bread." And they weren't being metaphorical. So, let's zoom in again. You're an ancient Egyptian. You don't own a wallet. Your ATM is a granary guarded by a man who definitely peaked in school and hasn't smiled since the reign of Thutmose III. And instead of a debit card, you carry a clay token that says, quite literally, 2 barley loaves, redeemable upon sunrise. Welcome to fiscal responsibility. 1500 BCE edition. Bread wasn't just food. It was infrastructure. Bakers, in this society, weren't just skilled laborers. They were economic engineers. They were producing the stuff that ran the economy, the way semiconductors do today. Except, instead of overheating, these loaves might attract ants or collapse under the weight of their own symbolism. Bakers worked in state-sponsored facilities, often attached to temples or royal estates, where loaves were churned out by the hundreds, for soldiers, scribes, farmers, and bribable priests. These loaves came in standardized shapes and sizes. Emmer wheat and barley were the primary ingredients, not because they were delicious, they weren't, but because they were tough, durable, and could survive long-term storage. Sort of. Let's be honest, ancient bread was somewhere between a snack and a blunt weapon. This is bread that could break your teeth and your spirit. Still, this wasn't a free-for-all carb fest. Granaries were secured with seals, literal clay seals stamped with the mark of a supervisor. Break that seal without permission, and congratulations, you've committed state-level grain fraud. And let me tell you, the punishment was not a slap on the wrist. It was more likely a slap across the face with a scroll full of economic law, possibly followed by bread confiscation. But let's talk about storage. Have you ever worried about your money losing value due to inflation? Well, ancient Egyptians had to worry about their bread literally molding in storage. This is what made grain silos and granaries so important. They weren't just warehouses. They were financial institutions. They needed ventilation, guards, scribes, systems. The scribes were the real heroes and villains of this system. These were men, always men, trained from boyhood to write hieratic or hieroglyphic scripts, keep records, and audit others. Their handwriting could ruin you. Their ledgers had power. One mistaken tally and suddenly your family is accused of hoarding 7 extra loaves during a barley shortage. And these scribes were everywhere. Every field, every granary, every temple had one. They didn't just document production, they recorded daily distributions, noted any debts incurred, and updated temple inventory like it was an ancient version of QuickBooks. There are actual papyri from Deir el-Medina, the workers' village for tomb builders, where the daily bread allotments are listed by name. You can read something like, month 3, inundation season, 4 loaves to Ka, 2 loaves to Merit, with permission, 1 beer. Note, Merit complained the beer was flat. It's that granular. Literal ancient HR complaints. And yes, beer also featured heavily in this carbohydrate-based economy. Beer and bread were two sides of the same nutritional coin. Both were made from grain. Both were distributed as rations. And both were subject to wage negotiations. Some workers even staged early labor strikes because their beer rations were cut. One document even records them saying, "We will not work because our beer is not here." Which is, frankly, iconic. In some villages, there were even seasonal differences in bread pay. During the inundation, when the Nile flooded, workers might receive more rations due to extra labor demands. During lean months, well, you better hope your manager was in a good mood, or you were very persuasive with a leftover onion. Let's not forget bread-based taxes. Every farmer owed a portion of their harvest to the state. Not just grain, but bread made from that grain. If you couldn't meet your quota, your land could be seized. Or worse, your labor demanded. There's a letter from a farmer complaining that tax collectors came and took not only his bread but his ox and his sandals. That's not a tax audit, that's a mugging in slow motion. And for those who really wanted to flex, offering bread to the gods was a status move. Temples had massive kitchens just for preparing sacred loaves. These were not for consumption, these were for display. Bread so holy, it never got eaten. Which is frankly sad. Imagine working all day to bake a loaf that goes straight to decorative altar status. Like working in a bakery where your only customer is a statue of Ra who never tips. Even children were taught about bread as currency. In schools, students practiced writing their names and numbers on fragments of old bread rations. Not because they were hungry, but because everything in their world revolved around the loaf. Bread meant survival. Bread meant wealth. Bread meant power. So yes, this wasn't just food as payment. This was an entire economy needed into existence. The only thing more powerful than a pyramid in ancient Egypt? A well-documented loaf of bread, signed by a scribe, stored in a sealed granary, and blessed by a sun god. Welcome to the domination of history. Let's say you've done well. You're an Egyptian farmer who's worked hard, managed not to offend the tax collectors. And now, miracle of miracles, you have extra bread. What now? You can't exactly stuff it under your papyrus mattress. No one wants to wake up with weevils nibbling at their nether regions. So instead, you do what any responsible adult would, you store it in the local granary. A building that was part vault, part temple, part very suspicious smell. Granaries weren't just buildings, they were bread banks. These massive, dome-shaped storehouses dotted the Nile landscape like carb-filled fortresses. Thick mud brick walls kept out the sun. Narrow vents kept out the damp. Large clay jars kept out, well, most rats. Sort of. Okay. Let's be honest, there were rats. But they paid rent in fear. Your bread account was managed by a scribal bureaucrat whose job was to track every loaf, every barley chunk, and every suspiciously light amphora. Want to withdraw some bread to pay your neighbor for fixing your fence? Submit a request. Wait 3 days. Get your approval stamped. And boom, you're handed your loaf with a ceremonial "May your carbs sustain you." The bureaucracy was slow. But hey, it's not like the bread was going anywhere. Unless the fungus got it first. Ah yes. The mold. See. While today we worry about interest rates or inflation, ancient Egyptians had to worry about fungal bloom. You could walk into your granary and discover your savings were now a furry science project. A greenish curse sent by angry gods, or possibly just bad ventilation. Some loaves would turn black. Others grew hair. A few just straight up disintegrated. Financial loss smelled like sourdough and betrayal. In fact, some religious texts mention fungus as a form of divine punishment. Displease the gods? Your bread goes bad. Cheat a temple out of barley? Say goodbye to your loaves. In this economy, fungus was inflation. And it didn't just eat your wealth, it mocked you while doing it. To counter this, some granaries got creative. There are records of workers fumigating silos with incense, offering prayers to grain deities, and even sprinkling natron salts around the floor to ward off the damp. If modern banks had the same system, we'd be chanting to the Federal Reserve with burning cinnamon sticks before payday. Now, if your bread was especially valuable, say, temple offerings or royal reserves, you might store them in sealed vaults, marked with ceremonial seals made of clay and string. These were your medieval pin codes. Break the seal without authorization, and you were toast. Not metaphorical toast. Literal. Ancient Egyptian punishments were rarely subtle, and don't even think about stealing bread. Bread theft was taken very seriously. There are entire legal scrolls detailing bread disputes, thefts, and frauds. He who takes bread from his neighbor's silo without permission shall be flogged 5 times and return the moldy loaf in penance. Imagine getting beaten up and still being stuck with expired carbs. And, oh, the drama. In one case, a worker was accused of replacing temple loaves with counterfeit bread. He allegedly baked smaller loaves and tried to pad the bottom with sand to meet weight requirements. This man was literally sandbagging his taxes. Officials launched a full investigation. Witnesses were called. Bread samples were weighed. Scribes furiously scribbled. The man was fined, flogged, and banned from temple kitchens. His reputation crumbled faster than his crust. For the average citizen, bread hoarding became an art form. Wealthy households had private storerooms. Some wrapped loaves in linen to preserve them. Others stored bread underground like ancient sourdough dragons protecting their treasure. But this led to even more problems: bread bandits. Yes. People would sneak into neighbors' yards and steal bread caches. This wasn't just petty theft. This was economic sabotage. You didn't just lose lunch, you lost purchasing power. Temples even employed bread guards. These were usually older workers, armed with sticks and a deep suspicion of everything. Their job was to stand watch outside bread chambers, looking menacing and occasionally swatting at hungry cats. A noble task, if ever there was one. And here's the kicker: some temples never spent their stored bread. It just sat there, slowly decomposing as a symbol of divine abundance. This is the ancient equivalent of hoarding gold you'll never use. Or worse, baking a cake you won't eat, because it honors Ra. Meanwhile, your neighbor's kid is chewing on a rock and pretending it's a scone. Eventually, mold became so common that it earned nicknames. In some documents, moldy bread was referred to as the whisper of Osiris, poetic and gross. Others called it the green beard of shame. If your bread grew a beard, you had clearly sinned. So what did all this mean? Well, it meant that in ancient Egypt, your wealth could rot. Your savings could turn to spores. Your pension plan could go fuzzy in the night. And in the middle of all this were the scribes, quietly noting, account 204, family of Kpakar, bread quality, poor. 1 loaf sprouted again. May consult the priest. Economics, ancient style. So now you've baked your bread, stored it in rat-proof-ish vaults, survived a couple of mold attacks, and maybe even earned a reputation as someone with a high gluten net worth. Congratulations! You are now ready for the final level of ancient economic greatness, the trade game. Because what good is 1,000 loaves of barley bread if all your neighbors are also sitting on their own piles of crusty assets? Eventually, some genius in a linen kilt asked, what if we took our bread and traded it for stuff? And so, the bread-based barter economy was born. Let's start with local markets. In many parts of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, bread wasn't just money, it was menu. You didn't just use it to buy a goose, you could trade it for a goose, or a pot, or a haircut, or possibly a goat massage. It all depended on the quality of your loaf. There were even exchange rates, informal. Of course. 3 medium barley loaves for 1 clay amphora. 4 if you want it uncracked. People argued about crust thickness like modern finance brothers argue about Bitcoin volatility. And of course, this system brought in the hustlers. Some traders started to inflate their bread, literally, by adding extra yeast or air pockets. They made loaves look bigger than they actually were. Others dyed their bread darker to make it look more expensive. Dark loaves were seen as richer, more nourishing. A kind of ancient carb flex. One well-known trick was the hollow loaf scam, baking a massive round loaf with nothing inside. To the untrained eye, it looked hefty. But slice it open and poof, it was emptier than the promises of a pyramid-building contractor. Naturally, word spread. Markets became battlegrounds of bread authenticity. Some towns began appointing bread inspectors, really, to test the weight and density of loaves. These were the auditors of the ancient world, armed with clay weights and a deep distrust of bakers. Now let's zoom out. Bread's value wasn't just local, it became a portable form of wealth. Like ancient credit cards made of crust, Egyptian merchants traveling up the Nile would carry dried loaves sealed in linen and wax. These were hard loaves, baked to last weeks. Not for eating, gods no, but for trading. Think of them as stale, crunchy coins. In some parts of the Near East, there are records of international bread exchanges. Traders from Crete or the Levant would arrive at Egyptian ports, open up crates of copper, timber, or dyed fabrics, and leave with amphorae full of barley bread. Because when your homeland has no agriculture but wants to host a feast, Egyptian bread becomes luxury import. Bread became diplomatic currency too. During New Kingdom Egypt, pharaohs often sent lavish gift baskets to neighboring rulers, not just filled with gold or perfumes, but with elite temple-baked bread, wrapped in lotus leaves. Receiving it was a sign of respect. Rejecting it was practically a declaration of war. There's even one dramatic letter from a Babylonian king who whined to Pharaoh Ramesses II because his gift bread arrived late and dry. He described it as unfit for man or dog, and added, in what can only be called the ancient version of a Yelp review, my dogs sniffed it and walked away. Is this how Egypt honors its allies? Meanwhile, in smaller villages, bread trade remained beautifully chaotic. You could walk into a marketplace with a basket of loaves and leave with anything from sandals to songbirds. Of course, haggling was intense. One document from Deir el-Medina records an argument where a woman refused to give her husband bread unless he promised to build her a new door. His reply? Then I shall starve and the gods will judge us both. Romance was clearly alive and fermented. Bread also had seasonal value. After harvest, the market was flooded with fresh loaves, prices dropped. But during droughts or locust plagues, bread became literal gold. Hoarders made fortunes. Families fought over crusts. Bread riots broke out. One scribe described a famine where women exchanged their children for 2 loaves. Don't worry, he was probably exaggerating. Probably. In times of war, bread was ransom. If your village was raided, you might save your life by handing over every loaf you had. One tale tells of a priest who stopped an invading band by baking them the largest flat bread ever seen, supposedly 10 cubits across. Whether that's true or just ancient PR spin, we'll never know. But it worked. Even in death, bread followed you. In tombs across Egypt, archaeologists have found loaves carefully placed next to mummies, flatbreads, barley buns, and sometimes entire baked altars. These weren't offerings for the gods. They were posthumous wallets. The idea was simple: when you got to the afterlife, you'd need currency. And the safest bet? Still bread. One tomb inscription reads, "May my loaves feed me before the tribunal of Osiris. May I not go hungry while my soul is weighed." Basically, please don't let me be broke in the underworld. So in the grand chessboard of ancient life, bread was queen. Trade it, hoard it, bless it, or die without it. You could be a merchant, a farmer, a priest, or a king, bread was your first paycheck, your retirement plan, your gift, your bribe, your insurance, your status symbol, and, if you were lucky, your lunch. But also, it was perishable. 1 week you were a bread baron. The next, you were wondering why your savings had started attracting beetles. And thus, the bread economy of the ancient world taught one timeless lesson: no matter how rich you are, sooner or later, something's gonna eat your dough. So, you've mastered baking, storing, and even trading bread. But here's where things get weird. Bread wasn't just about calories or commerce anymore. It started becoming symbolic. That's right. What was once a humble lump of flour and fire became a social flex, a religious artifact, and in some cases, a political statement. Let's start with the elites. In ancient Egypt, bread wasn't just bread, it was a status indicator. The higher up you were in the social pyramid, pun very much intended, the more elaborate your bread became. While commoners were stuck gnawing on dense barley loaves with the texture of concrete and surprise rocks, thanks to sand in the flour, nobles feasted on fine white emmer bread, soft, light, and so refined that even their teeth didn't complain. One tombed mural even shows a nobleman sniffing his bread like it's fine wine, with a caption that translates loosely to, "This loaf was baked in the temple, blessed by the gods, soft as the thighs of Hathor." Yes. Apparently thigh-soft bread was a big deal. Comfort food. But make it divine. But it wasn't just about softness. There were shapes, dozens of them. Some bread was shaped like animals, some like pyramids, some like miniature gods. There's even evidence of fish-shaped loaves used during Nile festivals, and scarab-shaped buns baked as offerings. The more complex the shape, the more important you were, or wanted people to think you were. In some households, bread was a way to show off your piety. Priests were often given rations of bread as part of their temple duties, and in turn, they'd offer elaborately baked loaves to the gods. Some of these were not meant to be eaten at all. They were baked hard as bricks and placed in shrines. One scribe described them as holy, yes, edible, only for those who wished to meet Osiris early. Meanwhile, the poor had coffin bread, no, not bread in coffins, although that happened too, but loaves so dry and dense that they might as well be. These were made from low-quality grain, baked quickly, and stored in huts until mold or mice got to them, whichever came first. A peasant's proverb summed it up best: eat the king's bread, live like a god, eat the farmer's bread, and chew until your teeth abandon you. But bread wasn't just a class thing, it was ritualistic, sacred, and occasionally weaponized. Take the case of the cursed loaf of Akhetaten. According to legend, during a succession dispute, a rival priest baked a loaf with a curse inside it, literally. The dough was inscribed with an incantation to make the next eater suffer cramps of the bowels and whispers of madness. The loaf was then accidentally gifted to a young noble. Did it work? Hard to say. But the noble did end up wandering into the desert, naked, proclaiming himself the god of onions. Bread was also gendered. Some shapes were reserved for men, others for women. In certain fertility rituals, women would bake and eat bread shaped like male anatomy, in public. No one blushed. This was serious theology. One tablet from Sumer even records a prayer: "May the loaf rise as the seed of Enlil, and nourish the womb of our fields." To which modern historians can only say, wow, that escalated quickly. Now, we can't forget about the criminal uses of bread. Yes, crime. There are records from Babylon of people forging bread tokens, clay representations of rations, handed out to workers instead of actual food. Some desperate souls tried to duplicate these tokens with mud and ink, hoping no one would notice until mealtime. Spoiler, they noticed. Even more dramatically, There are cases where poison was hidden in bread, especially during political plots. One failed assassination involved smuggling a toxic herb into a ceremonial loaf meant for a high priest. Unfortunately for the assassin, the bread was first offered to the gods, a ritual that involved leaving it on an altar for days. By the time the priest got it, the poison had dried out and the loaf was too hard to eat. Irony. Thy name is crust. In ancient Greece, bread had a theatrical flair. During festivals like the Thesmophoria, women would bake secret ritual breads and bury them underground, letting them ferment until the next season. Then they'd be dug up, half decomposed, and used as sacred offerings. If you're wondering what that smelled like, imagine gym socks marinated in yeast. Now imagine praying over it. Rome? Rome took bread pride to a whole new level. The emperor himself was often depicted with bread tributes at his feet, literal offerings from the people. In the Panem Circenses system, bread and circuses, free loaves were handed out by the government to keep the public calm while gladiators distracted them with blood sport. Some emperors even branded loaves with their own image, turning each bite into a tiny act of propaganda. You're not just eating carbs, they seemed to say, you're eating Caesar. And just when you thought this couldn't get weirder, some regions believed that stale bread could ward off evil spirits. Households hung loaves above doors or under beds. One particularly bold superstition claimed that placing burnt toast under your pillow could stop nightmares. Another advised mothers to rub bread on their babies' heads to transfer the hunger demons into the crust. Honestly, we've all been there. In short, bread, in the ancient world, was everything: money, meal, religion, medicine, ritual, social status, and sometimes psychological warfare. A loaf wasn't just something you ate. It was something you used to declare who you were, what you believed, and how far you were willing to go to either please the gods, or poison a rival. And while today we might reduce bread to white or whole wheat, in those days, your loaf said more about you than your title, your home, or even your sandals. It was biography, belief, and bank account, all rolled into one. If you think modern banks are complicated, with interest rates, loans, and savings accounts, then welcome to ancient Egypt, where a savings account could literally be a room full of bread. No internet banking here, but plenty of mouse banking. You deposit it, and rodents deduct their commission. Introducing the economic system of grain-based storage. Ancient edition. In ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and later in Rome, people didn't just use bread as currency, they stored it like treasure. The wealthy, priests, or officials would stash loaves in personal granaries or in state-controlled or temple-run warehouses. These weren't just piles of carbs, oh no. They were audited, sealed, and often accompanied by detailed clay tablets like, Mr. Ank has deposited 130 loaves, 20 jars of beer, withdrew 30 loaves during the festival of Ra, remaining 100. Signed, the warehouse cat. Of course, no OTP required. If anything went missing, you either blamed the mice or the gods. Some accounts were even opened before birth. Yep, parents could deposit bread and beer ahead of time, forming a sort of ancient college fund, just with more yeast and fewer student loans. People even wrote their wills in loaves. Upon my death, divide the Memphis bread vault as follows: wife, 40 loaves, eldest son, 30 loaves and 1 jar of beer, remaining 10 loaves, please hire musicians for my funeral, but not the loud ones. And yes, like modern banks, security was a problem. Bread attracts more than just poor poets, it attracts rodents. Warehouses had guards, seals, and religious wards stuck to the doors. But unfortunately, mice can't read holy warnings. And let's not forget the humidity. In ancient Egypt's climate, stored bread could go from soft and sacred to brick with mold garnish in days. Some archaeologists believe that old bread was sometimes reused as bricks, yes. Literal bread bricks. The world's most underwhelming construction material. One tragicomic story, preserved on a Sumerian clay tablet, tells of Gish-Lugal, a man who saved over 200 loaves for his wedding. But then came the rainy season. The storage roof leaked. Mold spread like gossip in a village tavern. By the time he came to retrieve his downy bread, it had become a sort of sourdough soup. The wedding was called off. His fiancée married the neighbor, who, smartly, buried his bread underground in sealed pots like a crypto trader with a cold wallet. So next time your bank charges you a withdrawal fee, think of Gish-Lugal, who lost his life savings to rain and poor roofing. In Babylon, they had actual bread contracts, written deals to supply loaves regularly, like a rental agreement, but with more gluten. One such contract read, Enki Murad will bake 30 loaves/month for the temple of Inanna. If late, penalty, 5 loaves and a slap from the high priest. Some folks got fancy. Records show the elite sometimes stored ornamental loaves, never meant to be eaten, just to show they had them. Like flexing your crypto wallet on Instagram, except with stale carbs. One man even inscribed on the tablet, I deposited 500 loaves and never withdrew a single one. I just want the world to know I could. Ladies and gentlemen, we've found ancient Instagram. Unsurprisingly, bread-based litigation was common. One such case, preserved in Memphis records, involved a man who returned home after a 3-month absence. He opened his vault to find crumbs. His wife said, "You were gone. And the goddess Isis told me to eat it before it molded." The local judge ruled, divide the vault equally, which didn't mean much. There was barely anything left. As time passed, bread vaults became even more sophisticated. In Rome, there were paneria, bread banks where bakers stored loaves for resale or trade, like a black market for baguettes. And of course, every bank needs robbers. One famous incident in Thebes involved 3 men breaking into a temple bakery on a full moon. They managed to steal over 70 loaves, but they were caught because one of them couldn't resist eating on sight, leaving a trail of crumbs and getting busted with bread bits in his beard. In the end, all this shows that bread was more than food, it was wealth, status, trust, and sometimes the reason ancient financial empires crumbled. If you think modern taxes are bad, try living in ancient civilizations, where not only did you have to pay your dues to the state, you had to bake them yourself. In ancient Egypt, Babylon, and even parts of medieval Europe, taxation wasn't just a cold number on a slip of paper. No, it came piping hot, fresh from the oven. Governments didn't care about your love for gluten-free alternatives. Your obligation to the state was measured in loaves, not love. Let's begin in Egypt, the original land of carbs and bureaucracy. Here, taxes were paid in the form of grain or baked bread. Officials, called scribes, but more like ancient IRS agents with eyeliner, would visit households and record your bread production. If you were a peasant farmer, they expected a specific amount of wheat, barley, or loaves depending on your land. And if you didn't meet the quota, simple, you got taxed more. Or worse, you got whipped. The logic was clearly, you're poor and starving? Wonderful. Let us increase your contribution. One surviving scroll even states, let no man who produces under 50 loaves be spared the rod. The gods desire full granaries. Imagine going to jail because your sourdough didn't rise fast enough. Ancient tax day was truly crust. Why? In Mesopotamia, the Babylonians were even more creative. They taxed everything: bread, taxed; barley, taxed; owning a bakery, taxed; breathing near a bakery, probably taxed; sneezing while holding a loaf, double taxed. Clay tablets from the time list elaborate tariffs. One hilarious entry reads, If a baker sells a loaf that weighs less than declared, he shall be fined 5 loaves and made to knead dough in the market square for a full day while being shouted at by passers-by. Now that's public accountability. In Assyria, things got darker. Some taxes weren't just economic, they were ritualistic. Bread offered to temples had to be of a certain size, shape, and holiness. If your tax bread was too burnt or too small, it was considered sacrilegious, and could lead to divine punishment, or at least a stern lecture from the high priest's assistant who hadn't had lunch yet. And let's not forget medieval Europe. By the Middle Ages, bread taxation became outright weaponized. Lords would demand loaves as part of the peasants' feudal duties. These weren't symbolic either, they had to be fresh, properly made, and delivered to the manor on time, or penalties would apply. One record from 12th century France mentions a peasant named Jean who was fined for delivering bread that was too dry and emotionally uninspired. Yes. Apparently your bread had to convey joy. And just like today's tax codes, loopholes existed. Some clever bakers tried stuffing hollow loaves with straw to save on flour. Others would bake oversized crusts but with hollow middles, ancient baguette fraud, if you will. Eventually, some towns passed bread laws, regulating what kinds of loaves could be sold or taxed. In England, the assize of bread, 1266, set the price and weight of loaves relative to grain prices. If you tried to shortchange customers, or the crown, you'd be fined, shamed, or in some cases, have your bakery shut down by angry mobs armed with stale biscuits. Fun fact, the term baker's dozen, 13 instead of 12, originated because bakers feared being accused of under-delivering. Giving an extra loaf was insurance against accidental bread treason. But of course, taxation wasn't limited to humans. In ancient Thebes, a law once dictated that temple cats, yes, cats, were to be fed tax-funded bread soaked in goat's milk. A man who tried to switch to water for budget reasons was slapped with an accusation of blasphemy and forced to offer double bread to the temple of Bastet. So remember, in the ancient world, bread was sacred, monetary, taxable, and, if mishandled, could get you publicly flogged, financially ruined, or spiritually cursed. We've come a long way, sure, but not that long. At least today, when you file your taxes, you don't have to worry about mice eating your refund. Yet, if you've ever burned toast and muttered a prayer to your toaster, congratulations, you've participated in the long and strange history of bread as a spiritual offering. But in the ancient world, this was no small affair. Bread wasn't just sacred. It was divine currency, celestial tribute, and occasionally, a bribe for the afterlife. Let's start in ancient Egypt, where the journey to the afterlife required more carbs than a marathon. Egyptians believed that when you died, your spirit continued to need sustenance, and that included daily bread. Tombs were often stocked with loaves, sometimes sculpted out of clay, but preferably real, edible ones, because even the dead apparently had gluten cravings. In fact, one tomb inscription reads, "May this bread rise for you in the field of reeds, and may it not be stale." Imagine being resurrected in the afterlife and the first thing you bite into is 3,000-year-old sourdough. That's not eternal peace, that's eternal indigestion. Pharaohs, of course, got the gourmet stuff, honey bread, date-stuffed loaves, and sacred barley buns shaped like ankhs. But even humble workers were buried with modest flatbreads, often placed beside their mummified pets. Because what is eternal companionship without eternal carbs? Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, bread offerings weren't just for the dead, they were for the gods themselves. Every major deity had a taste preference. Enlil liked barley loaves, Inanna got honey cakes, and Ninkasi, goddess of beer, obviously received bread soaked in brew. Temples had full-time bakers, and their job was so important they were exempt from military service. That's right, sorry. Can't go to war. I'm on sacred quests on duty. Offerings had to be fresh and plentiful. Spoiled loaves meant angry gods, bad harvests, or sudden mysterious spoils. A priest in Lagash once forgot to sprinkle sesame on a ritual loaf, and legend says he woke up bald. Coincidence? Or sesame fueled divine wrath? But things got even more bizarre in ancient Greece. During certain rituals, Greeks would bake phallic-shaped bread, yes, that shape, and carry them in procession for fertility festivals. There's an actual term for this, alisbacolics. The world's least appetizing dinner roll. They believed this ensured crop fertility and, apparently, robust social lives. And then there's Rome. Oh, the Romans. They were equal parts refined and unhinged when it came to spiritual carbs. Priests known as pontifices would inspect ritual bread for flaws, cracks, discoloration, or bad vibes. Loaves deemed unworthy were tossed into the Tiber River, which means Rome basically had a running stream of gluten sacrifices 24/7. And if you think that's wasteful, consider this: Romans had a sacred loaf called panis quadratus that was carved into sections, not for sharing, but because even the gods didn't want uneven slices. In Northern Europe, bread was used in protection rituals. One Viking practice involved placing a piece of rye bread under the threshold of a house to ward off trolls and bad luck. A kind of gluten-based alarm system, if you will. In Slavic traditions, bread was offered to spirits of the forest, domovoi, placed on windowsills overnight. If the bread was gone in the morning, it meant the spirits were pleased. If not, well, you had to bake a better loaf. No pressure. But perhaps the most haunting use of sacred bread comes from medieval Christian Europe. During Mass, the Eucharist, bread symbolizing the body of Christ, was treated with extreme reverence. Stealing or misusing it was not just a crime, it was heresy. Entire trials were held over the fate of a single wafer. One man in 14th century France was burned at the stake for accidentally dropping the communion host and not kissing the ground afterward. The lesson? Always respect your croutons. There are even records of miracle loaves, bread that bled, glowed, or whispered, usually after too much wine. Pilgrims would travel miles to see these, only to realize they were often mold-induced hallucinations. And yet, through all this ceremony, superstition, sacrifice, the humble loaf remained the eternal mediator between humans and the divine. It didn't matter if you were a pharaoh or a farmer. When the time came to pray, beg, or bribe the gods, you didn't bring jewels. You brought bread, because even in the spiritual realm, no one says no to carbs. As with all great currencies, be it gold, silver, or Dogecoin, the reign of bread as legal tender eventually came to a crumbly end. Not with a bang, but with a stale, slightly moldy whimper. Let's begin with the obvious problem: perishability. Ancient economies that used bread as payment constantly battled with the fact that bread has a shelf life slightly shorter than a fruit fly's career in Hollywood. In warm climates, loaves could go from currency to compost within days. Imagine being an accountant in ancient Egypt. Sire, the treasury has expired. The workers building the pyramids, who were paid daily in bread and beer, reportedly ate their wages immediately. Not because they were hungry, though they were, but because holding on to their pay for even a few hours meant it could go bad, like getting paid in milk during a heat wave. Then came the fungus crisis. Enter Claviceps purpurea, also known as ergot, a charming little fungus that loved to grow on rye. When consumed, it caused hallucinations, seizures, gangrene, and a sudden urge to confess sins you hadn't even committed. In the Middle Ages, entire villages experienced outbreaks of ergotism. One chronicler described it as a dancing plague sent by the devil. The afflicted shriek, laugh, and gnaw at their own limbs. No one thought, maybe it's the bread? Instead, The local baker was often promoted for making the people more spiritual. The inherent instability of edible money also meant it was ripe for corruption, pun intended. Grain quality varied. Loaves could be underweight. And bakers were occasionally accused of shaving the crust, literally baking hollow bread to pocket more dough. This became such a problem that in 13th century England, King Henry III introduced the Assize of Bread and Ale, a law regulating the price, size, and quality of bread. Bakers who violated the law were subject to public shaming in a contraption called the pillory, often with stale loaves tied around their necks like necklaces of shame. One enterprising baker, upon being caught selling underweight loaves, famously declared, "It's not theft. It's artisanal minimalism." This led to the creation of the baker's dozen, 13 loaves instead of 12, because bakers feared fines so much that they tossed in an extra loaf just in case their scale was off. Overcompensation, the medieval way. But the final straw came with monetization and state control. As economies grew more complex, governments realized that paying soldiers, merchants, and officials in bread was, frankly, ridiculous. Roman generals were tired of receiving sourdough bonuses. Egyptian scribes complained that their retirement packages turned green in 2 weeks. And let's not even talk about Viking pirates looting villages for pumpernickel. Coinage became standardized. Banking systems arose. The idea of abstract value, gold-backed currencies, promissory notes, and later, paper money, took over. You couldn't bribe a tax collector with focaccia anymore. No matter how well seasoned. Bread went back to being just bread. Well, almost. In times of extreme crisis, famine, siege, or war, bread as currency would rise again. Albeit briefly. In 18th century France, during the lead up to the revolution, bread was so scarce it became more valuable than coin. Riots broke out over baguettes. A woman was reportedly trampled over a crusty roll. Marie Antoinette allegedly said, "Let them eat cake." But the people responded, "We'll take the bread. Thanks." Today, bread lives on not as a currency, but as a symbol of sustenance, of simplicity, and occasionally, of governmental incompetence. So the next time you butter your toast, remember, you're spreading dairy on what was once a medium of exchange, a holy relic, a political tool, and a possible biohazard. And somewhere, in the dusty vaults of history, a banker in ancient Thebes is screaming, "Diversify your loaves." So, what have we learned today, fellow time travelers? That in ancient times, you could earn your daily bread. Quite literally. That economies once rose and fell, not on gold, not on oil, but on how well someone's yeast was behaving that morning. That somewhere in the labyrinthine halls of the Egyptian treasury, a high priest once said, completely seriously, "We're adjusting interest rates by reducing crust thickness." That during a bad harvest, your savings account could catch mold, and no, not metaphorically. That if you tried to bribe a Roman tax collector with garlic naan today, he'd probably call security, but back then, that might have scored you land rights and a camel. That medieval bakers had to offer one extra loaf. Not because they were generous, but because the legal system really hated being shortchanged by a croissant. And most importantly, we've learned that no matter how ridiculous it sounds now, bread was once power. Bread was wealth. Bread was survival. Fast forward to today. We tap cards, swipe phones, transfer invisible numbers across invisible banks, and complain about how expensive that artisanal sourdough is at the farmer's market. But maybe, just maybe, the ancient folks had a point. Because when the Wi-Fi's out, the banks are closed, and the world's in chaos, what would you rather have in your hands, a shiny piece of metal, or a fresh, warm loaf that you can eat? After all, you can't toast gold. And with that, dear viewers of Vale of Epochs, Thank you for joining me on this baked and bewildering journey through history. Be sure to like, subscribe, and maybe throw a baguette at the algorithm, it's hungry too. Until next time, stay curious, stay crusty, and remember, history is best served with butter.